Hello, welcome. In this lecture, we're going to understand the history through the eyes or through the works of Francois Bernier. Now, Bernier is the third such traveler that we are discussing in this lecture. We started with Al-Beruni, then we did Ibn Battuta, and today we're going to talk about Bernier. Now, all these three are important travelers. Why? Because they have extensively given an account of how things were like in India the time they traveled. Okay, but the time they traveled is very important. You see, the time for all these three is quite different. El Biruni basically came in the 10th, 11th century. If you remember, we discussed this that he came along with the Mahmud of Ghazni, right? Then Ibn Battuta came around the 14th century. So this was under the Tughlaq dynasty. Now Bernier, the one that we're going to study today, is coming into India, and this period is around the 17th century. So you understand that things would obviously be very different from the description of Al-Beruni or Ibn Battuta when it is done by Bernier. So the time period is extremely important, and of course at this period of time, we were actually under the Mughal rule. Along with that, there was an influx of the Europeans. So, this bit that I just told you that we were under the Mughal rule and there was an influx of the Europeans, this is extremely important. So, you see, what we're going to discuss under Bernier is we're going to understand his description of India in the sense of the society, the position of women, the concept of how politics was done, the concept of land, and all of those things. Now, this is a picture of Bernier. This is the 17th century picture of a European, painter describing Bernier. So let's get started. The first thing that we have to understand is Bernier as a doctor with a difference. Now you see, I've written here that things started with the advent of the Portuguese in India. Now, very important. You see, once the Portuguese basically arrived in India, and when did the Portuguese arrive in India? Firstly, you must remember that the Portuguese were the first to enter into India, right? Portuguese. When the Portuguese started to come in India, this is around 1498, right? This is around 1498. So when the Portuguese arrived, let's just simplify it for us that around the 1500s, a number of them wrote a detailed analysis of what a detailed analysis regarding the Indian customs, regarding Indian ways, the traditions and everything. So religion, society, all of these aspects were basically covered. Okay. Now, firstly, before we get into understanding Bernier, you have to understand that Bernier was not the first European, right? There's a history behind it, and the history is quite important. So, I told you that the Portuguese were the first to come, they gave a detailed analysis. Some of the examples of it could be Jesu Roberto Nobili. Now, Jesu Roberto Nobili was the first who actually came in and also did the work that he translated Indian texts into European languages, right? Then some of the other very well known Portuguese travelers or writers were that you have to understand there was Barbosa. Now, Barbosa gave a detailed account of what? Of trade and society in which part of India? In the south of India. All right. Then you have to remember that at a later stage, that is during the 1600s, a number of Dutch, a number of English, a number of French travelers came into India. All right, you see, these were the Portuguese people. Now, Dutch, English, and French all came to India. If you understand this, you see, when I say Europeans, okay, the advent of the Europeans, the Portuguese were the first to come, but they were not the only ones to come. There were Portuguese, there were Dutch, there were British, there were Danes, there were French. All of these came into India. All of these primarily came into India for what? For trade and commerce. You see, Indian goods, for instance, the spices, for instance, the muslin cloths, the silk, all of these things were of huge, were in a huge demand in the European markets. So when the first Portuguese, that is who, Vasco da Gama, came into India, he reached Calicut. What did he do? He actually purchased the things from the merchants here and he took it back to the European markets. When he sold them in the European markets, he understood that there's a huge amount of profit that he actually gained from that, from that trade and commerce. So he understood, and when he understood, the message soon spread. As a result of which, all these people came into India, right? Now, during the 1600s, the Dutch, English, and French, like I told you, they also came. Now, one of the very famous one is the French jeweler whose name was Travanier. He traveled to India almost 6 times. He was particularly fascinated by the trading conditions in India and he compared these trading conditions of India with Iran and what all places in the Ottoman Empire. Then an Italian, Manucci or Manucci, however you say it, he also came to India, and you have to understand that this person actually never returned back. That is, he stayed within India. He stayed in India. So these are the important names that you need to remember from the exam's purpose. It is Barbosa, it is Roberto Nobili, it is Manucci, it is the French jeweler, that is Travanier. Also do remember the things related to it. For instance, if it is in the exam, that which one amongst these European rulers stayed back in India and never returned? That is the Italian traveler Manucci, right? Now this is the status. All of these people came in, things started to change. Then Bernier came into India. Bernier came into India. He was a French person, so he was a French man, and he was a doctor, he was a political thinker, he was a philosopher, and he was also a historian. Right? Now, he came in to the Mughal Empire. All right, and like we have always discussed, the ground for the for the incoming, or for the ground for which these people came to India, if you remember, I discussed with you that Al-Beruni basically came. Why? Because Mahmud of Ghazni had attacked India, right? Then in the previous lecture we discussed that Ibn Battuta came. Why? Because Ibn Battuta was looking for opportunities, and he had heard a great deal about the Tughlaq, the Tughlaq dynasty in India, that the artists and everybody is patronized and the king is quite nice. All of those things were actually heard by him, which made him come to India. Now, what was the ground for Bernier? What was the ground for Bernier? You see, there was Mughal Empire in India, right? And Bernier, as the doctor, was what? He was the doctor of who? Doctor of the Prince Dara Suko. Now, who was Prince Dara Suko? Prince Dara Suko was the eldest son of the emperor, who? Shah Jahan. Okay, so he was a physician to Prince Dara Suko, the eldest son of the Emperor Shah Jahan, and later as an intellectual and as a scientist, he also worked in the Danishmand Khan. He was an Armenian noble. at the Mughal court. So he later assisted him, but when he came in, he was what? He was the physician to Prince Dara Suko. So this was the ground on which he came to India. Now, if you look into, if I actually have to describe to you in a matter of a line that what exactly was, the analysis of Bernier. So the subject matter of Bernier's account was what? Was the simple comparison of East and the West. You see, he gave a detailed analysis on this subject, that is drawing a comparison between how things are in the East and how things are in the West. So Bernier traveled to several parts of the country and wrote a detailed account on what he saw, how he felt about it, about the different situations. Okay, and all of these were actually compared with what? They were compared with how things are in Europe. Okay, so comparison with Europe. So please do remember this, that in his entire subject matter is simply drawing a comparison between the East and the West, right? Now, when he wrote all of these things, how he saw, what he felt, what were the situations like, all of these things were dedicated to, they were dedicated to the Louis or Louis XIV. Who was Louis XIV? He was the King of France. And why did he dedicate it to him? Because as we just understood that Bernier was a Frenchman. So he, this was his way of showing his allegiance to the king. So he dedicated his work to Louis XIV, the King of France, right? Now, you see, when he is describing all of these things are basically talking or giving us a picture of what? Picture of India under the Mughal rule. Under the Mughal rule. Now, this picture of India under the Mughal rule, whatever he has described, is not the whole picture. So you see, we will now be discussing the things that he described about India and how in reality the things work. So both the aspects of it are extremely important. What you have to understand that Bernier, whatever he wrote, was not the true picture, right? What exactly is the true picture? We'll also discuss this in the lecture, but you have to understand that whatever these travelers are writing, basically, it is from their own understanding, right? Now, since he's comparing the situation in our country with that of Europe, you can simply understand that him being a European person, he would obviously have a biased, he would always have a biased understanding or a biased, you know, perspective to write about the East. So you have to understand this, that whatever he wrote was not the accurate description, not the accurate description. We'll be discussing the examples of this in the lecture only, so do not worry. And what was the accurate picture is something that we will discuss. But most importantly, do remember that whatever he did write about India, that got really popular. That got really popular. And why do I say that? Because his works were actually being published in the year, that is 1670s and 1671, into English, into Dutch, and into German, and into Italian. So you can simply understand that there was a huge demand of his writings. Okay, that him being a Frenchman used to write in what? In French. So these texts in French were actually being translated into English, Dutch, Italian, German. Quite popular his writings were, right? Now, you have to understand that this is the time period, that is the time period between 1670 and 1725, that his works were actually reprinted. Reprinted how many times? 8 times in French. Okay, so this is was in, a great deal, this is a great example to help you understand that how exactly popular his writings were, or how famous he actually was, that not only were his texts being translated into different languages, his texts were also being reprinted in the French language. And also this is in a great contrast. What contrast? Contrast to the accounts of the Arabic and the Persian travelers who came in India and wrote about India, you see, their work was in the form of what? Manuscripts, right? And they were not generally published before the 1800s. So this is very important bit. Please do remember the extreme amount of popularity, and his works were in a great demand, right? So this is the basic introduction about Bernier. We're going to understand him in a great detail, starting with his first concept, that is Bernier and the degenerate East. You see, I just told you that when he came into India, he came into an India with a vision. And what was exactly that vision? That vision was the comparison of the East with the West. So you see, before Bernier, we have discussed Ibn Battuta. Now, Ibn Battuta had great things to write about India. He discussed, like we have already studied in the previous lecture, he discussed about the hustle bustle in the markets, right? He discussed about the two major cities, that is Delhi and Dolatabad. Then he discussed that the trade and commerce was extremely flourishing. It is he who actually told us that there is a fine muslin cloth which is only and only worn by the nobles and the extremely rich. So basically, in totality, he had nice things to say. But if you look at Bernier, if you compare all of this with Bernier, you'll find that this is absolutely something which is missing. So if Ibn Battuta chose to give, or chose to describe India in a sense that he was actually impressed by the picture, or he was actually impressed by what he saw, you know, his description of coconut, for instance, his description of betel leaf. So he was, in simple words, impressed. The same thing you will find is missing when it comes to who? When it comes to Bernier, right? So Bernier basically belonged to a different intellectual tradition. He was far more occupied with what? With comparison, or we can say he was far more occupied with drawing a comparison and analyzing and contrasting between the conditions in East and West. So whatever he saw in India, right, he immediately compared it with how things are in the West, right? Now, his idea seems to have influenced a lot of policymakers and the intelligentsia to ensure that what they did in the West was something which is considered to be the right decision. Why? Because whatever he saw in the East, he simply gave what? He gave a degenerate idea of it. So whatever was done being in the East was a wrong decision, and whatever done in the West was the right decision of it. So this is rather important that you do understand that he hardly had anything good to say about India. He has basically criticized India and criticized India on whatever subject that he saw in here. Okay, now Bernier's travels in the in Mughal Empire is marked by a detailed observation or critical insights and a reflection of, all right. So he'll be talking, for instance, about the question on land ownership. We'll look into it, but please do remember, all of this is dealing with comparison, with analyzing, and with contrasting how the things are in between the East and the West. Also, please do understand that when he is drawing a comparison, when he is analyzing, when he is contrasting, all of this is basically done in a hierarchical order. All right. That is, India is here appearing to be what? To be inferior than the West. Okay, or you can also put it like India is appeared in his text as something which is much inferior to the Western world, right? So this is the entire idea. Now let's understand this entire idea. How does he do it? So firstly, he questions the concept of land ownership. According to Bernier, one of the fundamental differences between Mughal Empire and how things are in the West, or how things are in Europe, is that in the Mughal Empire there's an absolute absence of what? absence of private property. There's an absolute absence of private property, or you can also put it like there's a lack of private property in land in the Mughal Empire. Whereas if you see West or the Europe, there was a concept of private property. And this is something which just did not sit well with Bernier at all. He has criticized this point in a great detail. Okay, so he was a firm believer in the virtues of private property, and he actually saw that the crown ownership of the land, which was something which was under the Mughal Empire, crown ownership of land is what is something which is harmful to both the state and also to its people. So this is something which was harmful to both the state and its people. And you see, since there was private property in the West, all of this situation was something which was absolutely absent in the West, according to the Bernier's, description of how things were. So he has said that there was widespread poverty. There was widespread poverty and the situation of the poor peasant. So let's now look into what he has actually written about India while studying these two important pictures here. So the first thing that you have to understand is that Pelsarit was a Dutch traveler was a Dutch traveler. He visited the subcontinent during the early decades of the 17th century. So contemporary of who? Of Bernier. So like Bernier, the name is very important. So like Bernier, he was shocked to see the widespread poverty. Poverty so great and miserable that the life of the people can be depicted or accurately described only as the home of the stark want and the dwelling place of bitter woe. Holding the state responsible, he says, so much is wrung from the peasants that even dry bread is scarcely left to fill their stomachs. So you can see that this is a description about how things were in India, and this is telling us about what? About acute poverty. All right, please do remember that Pelsarit was a Dutch traveler, and his and Bernier's account on how miserable things were in India under the Mughal Empire are quite similar, as both of them are talking about what? Widespread poverty. Now, let's understand the next picture, which is talking about the condition of a poor peasant. So, you see, before I discuss this picture with you, I want you to understand that when Bernier is actually giving us a description of how things were under the Mughal Empire, he's saying that there was an absence of private property. This basically means that land was not owned by the people. Land was under what? Land was under the empire. Okay, land was under the empire. So owing land was under the what we can also say is the crown ownership. So crown ownership of land is something which does just did not sit well with Bernier's understanding. Okay, he said that the landowner, if you see, I'll simply explain this to you. Let's say this is a piece of land. Okay, now this piece of land is belonging to, let's say, A person, B person, and C person. This is one situation. Now this is a piece of land, and all this piece of land is belonging to the king, to the king, to the king. Now, these are the two situations. What Bernier has described in India was this, and what Bernier has described in the West was this. Now, Bernier explains in very simple terms. What he says is that you see, when the owner of the land is this A person, this B person, then this C person, then the onus is going to be on who? On the owner. The onus is going to be on A, B, and C, that they have to take care of their land. Okay, that they have to, work for the irrigation facilities. They have to, basically ensure that this land's fertility is intact. They're going to invest into it. Okay, they're going to, buy new they're going to buy better seeds, they're going to buy new machinery, all of this. Why? Because they are the owners. And since they are the owners, after ABC go, their, their next generation, let's say D, E, F. Now this DEF is going to become the owners of this. So you see A, B, C, D, E, F, all these people are going to treat it as their own property. So of course, when you treat something as your own property, it's very natural that you're going to take care of it as well, right? But how Bernier has basically explained things in India is that every piece of land was under what? Under crown ownership. So since it is all under crown ownership, you will understand that due to the absence of private property in land, you see, there was an emergence of what? The poor peasants. There was an emergence of the improving landlords. Okay, you see, the people, that is the peasants, A, B, and C, they are not the owners of the land here. Okay, so it's very natural that they're not going to take care of their land like how it is being done in the West. Why? Because they are not the owners of it, so they're not going to put in as much effort into their land. Why? Because it is not their land. It is all belonging to who? It is all belonging to the empire. It is all belonging to the crown, right? So this is an important example how Bernier explains things were in India. So he's simply saying here that this basically led to a uniform ruination ruination of agriculture. Why? Because these poor peasants were not in a condition that they, from their own ends, will invest into the land, and naturally they would not invest into the land. Why? Because it is not theirs, right? So there was ruination of agriculture, and at the same time, there was an extreme amount of oppression by who? An extreme amount of oppression by the landlords. So the living standards of the entire society except the ruling landlords, that is who? The aristocracy. So all the others were miserable, all the others were suffering except who? Except the rich, except the nobles, except the aristocracy, right? So now let's deal with this picture here. Now you'll better understand how he is explaining the condition of a poor peasant in India. So this is an excerpt from Bernier's description of the peasantry in the countryside. Now he discusses that of the huge vast tracts of country constituting the empire of Hindustan, many are little more than sand or barren mountains, badly cultivated and thinly populated. Even a considerable portion of a good land remains untilled for want of laborers, many of whom perish in the consequence of bad treatment they experience from the governors. This is the aristocracy. The poor people, when they become incapable of discharging the demands of their rapacious lords and not only often deprived of the means of subsistence, but are also made to lose their children who are carried away as slaves. Thus, it happens that the peasantry, driven to despair by so excessive a tyranny, abandon the country. So exactly what we have discussed here, he's explaining the same thing here, that the condition of the poor peasant is that bad that they're not in a situation that they will you know they're just living on basic subsistence. For that matter, not even their basics are being covered, and the situation is that bad that they have to even sell their children as slaves. And we have already discussed in the previous lecture how actually slaves were being openly sold in the markets during that time period, right? So this is what he's describing about the nature of the poor peasantry in India. Now in this instance, Bernier was participating in contemporary debates in Europe concerning the nature of state and society, and intended that his description of Mughal India would serve as a warning to those who did not recognize the merits of private property. So this entire thing here is suggesting to us what? That there is an absolute merit when people have private property. There is an absolute merit of recognizing that private property is the way to be. Why? Because when there is a private property concept involved, people are actually going to care about it. Okay, things are not going to be badly cultivated. Things are not going to be untilled. Why? Because they are the people here who are responsible behind it. So since they are responsible, since it is their own, they're going to take care of it, right? So this is a very important aspect. Now the next point that you have to understand is that After understanding all of this, it is very simple for us to understand that when Bernier described the Mughal Empire, he described it as the king of beggars and the barbarians. Very important. You see, Bernier is describing here that there are, when we are talking about India, there is no middle state in India. What do I mean? There is no middle state in India. For instance, either they are the absolute rich or they are the absolute downtrodden. Do you understand? So there is either the rich, that is the aristocracy, or the extreme poor. There is no middle state in India. Why? Because of the concept. Now he obviously blames it on absence of private property in India, or absence of private property rather in Hindustan, because there was no India back then. But this is very important. So how does he describe the Mughal Empire? He describes it as the king of beggars and barbarians. Okay, please do understand that he actually wrote he actually gave a detailed analysis of why there is no middle state in India, and this is what a problem is with the Mughal Empire, as a result of which its subjects are miserable. Okay, so this is very important. How does he actually describe? You've seen how he describes the Mughal Empire. How does he describe the scene of India, that is Hindustan? So he actually says that the cities and towns are ruined, they are contaminated. He says there is ill air and the fields are overspread with bushes. They are full of what? Pestilential marsh, right? So you can simply understand from all these examples that he did not have very good things to say about India. He's saying that there is a reason behind all of this, and that simple reason is that in here there is a crown ownership of land, as a result of which people are quite miserable. Why? Because they own nothing of their own. Now, is this the true picture of it? Let's understand. You see, we have also other accounts through which we can have an insight into how things were under the Mughal Empire. So, Mughal official documents by Abul Fazl. Now, Abul Fazl was somebody who was under the rule of Akbar. So, Mughal Emperor Akbar. So Akbu Fazl is the 16th century official chronicle of the official chronicle was written by him, and he was obviously writing for who? Writing for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. Now, in Akbar reigns, he has described that things were not like how Bernier basically explains. So he says land revenue was seen as what? As a remuneration of sovereignty. What do I mean by remuneration of sovereignty? You simply understand that Abu Fazl, when he writes, he explains that, of course, land revenue was taken by the subjects. It was taken by the subjects. Why? Because it was a remuneration for the sovereignty. What does this basically mean? This basically means that this land, revenue, land revenue, the ruler used to take this. And why the ruler used to take this? Because the ruler used to provide to his subjects protection. Okay, now this is a protection from external aggression, from invasions, all of those things. So this has to be seen as a remuneration of sovereignty, right? Now he so rather than the rent on the land that he basically owned, this was a land revenue that was basically kept by the king. Why? Because it was a remuneration of the sovereignty. Why? Because he was providing protection in return. So this was not actually a rent or even a land tax. A land tax. This was basically what? This was basically a tax on the crop. So I can give you some examples of it. For instance, it was said that 1/6 of the crop would be taken by the king. Now this 1/6 is, how usually it was, but it obviously varied from one ruler to another. Somebody took 1/10, somebody took 1/5, but 1/6 was the common. So this is what you need to understand, and this is what Abul Fazl basically explains, that this was, this was not as dire or as extreme as Bernier basically explains. What was it? It was this. It was basically taken as, this, that we are providing you protection. What do you have to give to us in return is this. That is 1/6 or 1/10 or 1/5 of the crops, right? So this was a simple thing, tax on crop. Now, after Bernier's explanation of the things in India, there were two very important people who were really influenced by it. So, Bernier's description basically influenced thinkers, the Western thinkers, okay, and especially the theorists from the 18th century onwards. The first one that we're going to discuss is Montesquieu, the French philosopher. So he was highly impressed, and he was impressed to such an extent that he gave an idea of Oriental despotism. Or what exactly is Oriental despotism? If this term comes in the exam, you know it is coming from the French philosopher Montesquieu. Okay. Now, the idea of Oriental despotism basically means that the French philosopher Montesquieu used this term to give an account or to explain about the details of how things are in the East. Okay, the Orient or the East. So, Eastern despotism, Oriental despotism. Okay, what exactly is the word despotism? Despotism basically means that absolute power. Okay, absolute power which is within the hands of a ruler. So you see, there is this absolute power which is without any checks, which is without any limitations. So this absolute power given to one ruler, one emperor, one king leads to despotism. This is, this is an important term under polity, but what you have to understand is that Montesquieu used this Oriental despotism, that is what is happening in the East, that an absolute power is residing with one ruler itself. So this idea of Oriental despotism is telling us about what is it is, it is Montesquieu using this term to give us a detail or to give the West a detail about how things are in Hindustan. Okay, that the vast land, all resources, all power is residing with who? With the ruler. That is one king. As a result of which, all the others, that is the subjects of that kingdom, are what? They are in a miserable state. Right? So, they are in a miserable state, and also if you understand all of this, he also emphasized that that is why all land belonged to the king and the people really had nothing of their own, and this is according to him the need why private land or private property is an important concept. Why? Because this was something which was working in the West, and the West was flourishing according to these philosophers. Is this clear? Also, Montesquieu gave a very, important, uh, one second, gave a very important line in his works that you must remember. He says that everybody except the emperor and his nobles was barely surviving, okay, or barely managed to survive. So you can understand that the situation was quite extreme according to who? According to Montesquieu, the French philosopher in India. Now, this idea was further developed by who? By Karl Marx. And Karl Marx gave us the concept of Asiatic mode of production. What does this basically mean? Let's understand it in very simple words. You see, this idea was further this idea was further developed by who? By Karl Marx. And Karl Marx developed the concept of Asiatic mode of production. Basically, all this happening is in the 19th century. He argued that in India and in other Asian countries, in India and in other Asian countries, what is the problem? The problem is that all of this, that in Asia and all other countries, they are being ruled by what? Colonialism. Okay, and colonialism is not, giving them anything. In other words, he says that before colonialism, what was the situation? Before colonialism, all the extra, all the surplus was being what? Appropriated by the state. So when all the surplus was being appropriated by the state, what this resulted in was that there were autonomous, let me write it here, that they, you see, all the extra was being what? Appropriated by the state. And when it was being appropriated by the state, there was an emergence of a society that was composed of large numbers of autonomous and internally egalitarian village communities. Okay, now the imperial courts presided over these village communities, okay, and respecting their autonomy. So their autonomy was something respected, okay. But this, of course, changed with what? This changed with colonialism, because you see, colonialism was all about exploiting the resources, exploiting the wealth, and it was all about, drain of wealth. So this is what you need to understand. This was the concept. It was given by Karl Marx, right? Now, what was the honest picture? We have understood it from the perspective of Bernier, we've understood it from the perspective of Montez, then what Karl Marx had to add to it. But what exactly was the honest picture of the Indian rural society? You have to understand that. We'll be also talking about this in the coming chapters, but for the time being, I can give you a brief explanation about it. You see, you have to understand that the Indian rural society, as it has been explained above, it was not that. So the detailed analysis of how the society has been explained by all these philosophers, it is far from true. Okay, during the 16th and the 17th centuries, the rural society was characterized by a considerable social and economic differentiation. You see, at one end of the spectrum, there were the big zamindars. Okay, these big zamindars were what? They were well off. Why they were well off? Because they had superior rights in land. And at the other end were who? Were the untouchables. Now these untouchables were what? They were the landless laborers. And in between the big zamindars and the untouchables were who? In between were the big peasants. Were the big peasants. Now these big peasants did what? That they basically used to hire labor. Okay, and they used to hire labor and they used to get work done by who? By this hired labor. And the smaller peasant was also there above the landless laborers here. The small peasants could barely produce anything for their substance. So you see, like Bernier has just explained to us, that there were only two classes. There were the rich nobles, the royalty, the aristocracy, and the others were who? The really miserable people. Uh, there was no middle class. Let me just explain it to you here, this like so that you can link it. You see here that India is there is no middle state in India. They're either the rich or they are the downtrodden. So this is what was explained by Bernier under the Mughal Empire. But our historians, the true picture of India during the Mughal Empire actually speaks of what? That there was social and economic differentiation in the rural society. There were the big zamindars, there were the untouchables, that were the landless laborers, there were big peasants, and there were small peasants. So it was not anything like how Bernier has basically described. Of course, things were really hard, especially for who? Especially for the landless laborers. Then things were really hard for small peasants. But it doesn't basically go to show that there was no middle, you know, state. You were either rich or either you were extreme poor. So this is, we simply understand that Bernier's account is not accurate. So this is the honest picture of Indian rural society. So please do understand this. Now, Bernier has said that there is a more complex social reality, and let's understand it through what he has given a detailed analysis of in his works. So, if you read the excerpts from Bernier's description of both the agriculture and craft production. So we'll talk about both agriculture and craft production. What does he say? It is important to observe that this vast tract of country, a large portion is extremely fertile. The large kingdom of Bengal, for instance, surpassing Egypt itself, not only in production of rice, corn, and other necessaries of life, but of innumerable articles of commerce which are not cultivated in Egypt, such as silk, cotton, indigo. So what is he saying here up till now is that, you see, this is, now he's giving a little better picture of India, saying that this, all things are not doomed here. This land is extremely fertile. There is a large kingdom of Bengal, and it is surpassing Egypt itself. Why? Because not only is it growing a lot many crops, for instance rice, corn, and other necessities of life, but it is also an important place when it comes to art and commerce, for instance, about its silk, cotton, and indigo. And in the previous lecture, I told you about that Dhaka was extremely famous for muslin. So you can add that example here as well. Then there are also many parts of Indies which were where the population is sufficiently abundant and the land pretty well tilled, and where the artisan, although naturally indolent, that is lazy, is yet compelled by necessity or otherwise to employ himself in manufacturing carpets, brocades, embroideries, gold and silver cloths, and other various sorts of silk and cotton goods, which are used in the country or exported abroad. So you can simply understand that there was a trade and commerce situation that he's talking about. Then it should not escape notice that, very important, this is rather important, please pay attention, that it should not escape notice that gold and silver, after circulating in every quarter of the globe, come at the length to be swallowed up, lost in some measure in where? In Hindustan. So gold and other important metals, silver, all of these around the globe were coming and landing up where? In Hindustan. Why? Because of things that Hindustan had to offer, be it the agriculture, one second, be it the agricultural goods, yeah, be it the agricultural goods, its articles, jewels, all of these things were a great demand, especially in the West and also in the Southeast Asian countries, also in the Southeast Asia. So please do understand that he is talking about a different economic scenario. You see, when you take all of this into understanding, does any of what we have understood above, that they were either the extremely rich or they were the extremely poor, does any of it make sense? No. Why? Because you see, we are talking about here a land which is growing ample, which is growing enough of the things, which are growing things which are also in a great demand in the Western markets, along with the articles, so silks, cotton, indigo, all of these things. Then manufacturing carpets, brocades, embroideries, gold and silver cloth, all of these things, all various sorts of silk and cotton cloths, which were used either in the country or exported abroad. So you see, when they were exported abroad, what was the result of it? That you see, important metal, that is gold and silver, around the globe was being coming up and swallowed up in where? In Hindustan. So there is a, you can use this example to actually explain whether you agree with how Bernier has, you know given a detailed analysis of how things were in India. Of course, what he has said above, if you read this picture here, doesn't seem to be absolutely accurate. Now, Bernier has also given us a detailed account on the imperial karkhanas. Very important. What does he say? He says, let's understand this. Bernier is perhaps the only historian who provides a detailed account of working of the imperial karkhanas or the workshops. He says large halls are seen at many places called karkhanas or workshops for the artisans. In one hall, embroiderers are busy employed, superintended by a master. In another, you see the goldsmiths. In a third, you see painters. In a fourth, you see varnishers in lacquer work. In a fifth, joiners, turners, tailors, shoemakers. In the sixth, manufacturers of silk, brocade, and fine muslins. The artisans come every morning to their karkhanas where they remain employed the whole day and in the evening return to their homes. In this quite regular manner, their time glides away, no one aspiring for any improvement in the condition of life wherein he happens to be born. Now, of course, Bernier right now is giving us a detailed analysis of how, trade and commerce was in India like, okay, or how things were in India like, especially when it comes to goods and services. So you see, he's saying not only that, there was nothing actually happening, there was a lot happening. Why? We understand it through these pictures here. But he says the problem of it is that people were not working for themselves. They were working under what? They were working under the ruler. They were making things for who? For the rich. They were making things for the aristocracy, or either they were making things to export them to the other countries or to export them from abroad. But were they getting anything in return? No. Why? Because they were not working as, you simply understand it from today's situation. You today have a business of your own. If that business does well, you will do well, right? But here you see these were the imperial karkhanas. Okay, these were the workshops. All of the things that were here made by, let's say, the embroiderers or the goldsmiths, the painters, all of this was being consumed by either the rich or it was sent abroad. So there was nothing that these people, the ones who were working there, were getting out of it. And this is a problem that Bernier finds out. So here Bernier is basically saying that of course there was a great deal of activity. There was a great deal of activity, but there was hardly any progress. Very important. There was a great deal of activity happening. There was hardly any progress. Now, this is how, of course, Bernier describes it. Again, we'll look into it whether or not is it a true picture. So you see, the honest 17th century picture is very different. In fact, during the 17th century, about 15% of the population, about how much? The 15% of the population lived in what? Lived in towns. Now, this on average is higher than the population of the urban areas in the Western Europe, right? Now, Bernier is saying that this was the situation that, of course, there was work, but there was hardly any progress. This is not a true picture. Why? Because you see, there were towns, there were cities that were flourishing, right? So you have to understand that when Berner is giving us an example of the land ownership, that you see people are not owning the land, there is no concept of private ownership. This is not a true picture. Why? Because there were all kinds of towns and cities. How do we know that? You see, there were manufacturing towns, there were trading towns, there were sacred centers, there were pilgrimage towns. So this is an example that there were all different kinds of towns catering to all different kinds of work. This is an example which is telling us that there was an existence of, let's say, a merchant communities. There was an existence of professional classes, right? Why? Because otherwise, why would we have towns which are just known for their manufacturing, or towns which are just known for trading or sacred work or pilgrimages, all of this, right? Similarly, there were also port towns, very important. So you can use all of this. Then the historians actually say that things were not all doomed. Why? Because there were, merchants, trade and commerce, merchants and traders, one of the most important classes. They had a strong community. And how do we know that they had a strong community? Because they were organized into their own caste come occupational bodies. So in the Western India, these groups were called what? Mahajans. And their chief was called what? Their chief was called a Seth. Right? This is very important, can come in the exam. Please do remember this, okay? Then in the urban centers, for instance, let's say in Ahmedabad, the Mahajans were collectively represented by chief of merchant community who was called what? He was called somebody who's higher than this position. So he was called the Nagar Seth. And other urban groups also included different classes of people. For instance, there were, let's write it here, there were physicians. Physicians, you can also use the word hakims or veds, right? Then there were who? There were teachers. Teachers like pandits or mullah. Then there were lawyers. Lawyers, vakils. All right. Then there were painters. There were architects. There were musicians. There were calligraphers. So why are all of these people existing if what Bernier has to say is that everybody was simply working for the royalty, everybody was simply working for the crown, or all the things that they were working for were being either exported to outside of India to different countries? You see, we can of course understand, we're not now talking about the honest picture. We can of course understand that there were these people and these were basically dependent on imperial patronage. But were all of these dependent on imperial patronage? Were all of these working in only the imperial karkhanas? No, right? Yes, some of them could have been, but were all of them? No. You see, there is a possibility that some of them were also, serving the ordinary people. They were working in the bazaars. The bazaars that, Ibn Battuta has explained that, there was a lot of hustle and bustle. It was full of people. There were musicians, there were dancers who were performing in the bazaars. Were those things not existing here in the 17th century? So this is an important example. If it comes in the exam in the form of a critical analysis of Bernier's account, these are all the important points that you have to include in the answer, right? That all of that what he has said is not true. Why? Because 15% of the population was actually living in the towns in India during the 17th century. Then there were a number of towns and cities which were just known for the work that they provided: manufacturing towns, trading towns, sacred centers, pilgrimage centers, port towns. Then there were a number of other classes. Then you can use all these examples and please do include this in your answers. Now the last thing that we have to discuss today pertaining to Bernier is his description of sati. You see, like Ibn Battuta discusses the concept of women slaves. He says that women slaves were basically employed by the king himself. Why? Because they used to keep a check on the nobles. Okay, they used to live with the nobles and then they used to provide all the information. So they were basically they were used as spies, women spies. All right. Similarly, Bernier has chosen a concept, and that is sati, when he's explaining us about the position of women. So Bernier gives a detailed description of sati, and what does he say? He says, okay, he says this is perhaps the most poignant descriptions by Bernier on what? On sati. So he says, at Lahore, I saw a most beautiful young widow sacrificed who could not, I think, have been more than 12 years of age. Okay, 12 years of age. The poor little creature appeared more dead than alive. When she approached the dreadful pit, the agony of her mind cannot be described. She trembled and wept bitterly. But three or four Brahmins, assisted by an old woman who held her under the arm, forced the unwilling victim towards the fatal spot, seated her on the wood, tied her hands and feet, lest she should run away, and in that situation the innocent creature was burnt alive. I found it difficult to repress my feelings and to prevent their bursting forth into clamorous and unavailing rage. Now, this is his description of sati. Now, of course, we all understand that sati was an ill practice. Sati, to give you an extra bit here, sati was something which was abolished in 1849. It was done by Bentinck. So very important, 1849, and we are especially talking here about what, the 17th century. So you see, of course it would have been, a bitter truth. It's a bitter truth for us to accept that yes, sati was a practice that was indeed done, but to say that this alone is telling us about the position of women in the society, is this true? No, this is not true. At the same time, we are not denying that there was no child sati, that women were not actually forced to, or some of them actually wanted to do it themselves, but those who did not wanted to do it, they were forced. We are not denying any of this. The situation that he's describing here, that three or four Brahmins assisted by an old lady who held her under the arm, so this is an instance of being forced, right? We're not denying any of this. What we're simply denying here is that this is not the true position. This is not a true instance telling us about the position of women. Why? Because women's life revolved around much else too, much else too besides the practice of sati. Their labor was crucial both in agricultural and non agricultural production. Okay, women from merchant families participated in mercantile disputes to the courts of law. Women in merchant families also participated in commercial activities. It is therefore very unlikely for us now to understand that women were simply confined to their private spaces of their house, that is within the four walls, and this is all that their life was all about. That is, there would be child marriage, they would get married at an early age. In case of an unfortunate situation where their husband dies, they're going to commit sati, or they will be forced to commit sati, and this will be about it. So this is not true. Of course, there are also instances which are telling us about the existence of all these things. So this is again to be used when there is a critical analysis about Bernier's description of India. So this is very important. I hope this is clear. Please do remember that it was which European traveler which gave a detailed analysis of sati. It was Bernier, right? And women's life, the real picture is something that we have discussed here, that this is not true. Now, of course, there were issues, but whatever Ber- Bernier has explained to us when it comes to land, private land, imperial karkhanas, or imperial workshops, and women and sati, this is whatever we read through his work is not the accurate picture. Of course, there is some truths to it, but it is not the whole truth. So this is what I wanted to discuss with you. We have discussed Bernier from all the possible angles. This is rather important. Have a thorough understanding of this topic. And with this, we have done all the three important travelers, starting with Al-Beruni, then Ibn Battuta, and now today the French traveler, that is Bernier. So thank you for watching, and please stay tuned.